Hi, I'm Paul Eichelberger. I'm the treasurer of the Baltimore-Washington Conference. And it's my pleasure to be able to talk to you and introduce you to finance committees at our local churches. As a laity, I've always been keenly aware that the gifts that I've been given as laity are meant to be complements to our local church pastors. And so it's up to each one of us to look at our skill sets to understand how God has blessed us and how we can best use those in the local church. And I hope through this conversation we might be able to help you understand whether the finance committee at your local church might be a place for you to be able to express those gifts. So the basics of the finance committee is that it compiles a budget for the church. It submits the budget to the church council for their review and approval. And then once you have the budget in place, the finance committee is responsible to make sure that the funds are raised for that budget. And they're also in charge of administrating the funds of the church as well as supervising the treasurer and the financial secretary. So those are the basics of a finance committee. And when you think of the types of ministries that the finance committee touches, it wants to have on that finance committee a lot of different skills. So the types of jobs or the types of positions that are on the finance committee are listed in our book of discipline. And the book of discipline allows us to see that it's headed by a finance chair, and then they surround the finance chair with other folks. And the other positions that are responsible for being there is the pastor and the lay leader, the chair of the church council, the chair or the representative from the pastor-parish relations committee, a representative of the trustees, a chair of stewardship if you have a separate stewardship committee at the church, as well as the lay member of annual conference. Now the treasurer and the financial secretary and the business administrator also are on the finance committee. If they're paid members of staff, then they're just non-voting members of that committee. Now, in addition to those members, the council adds other people from the church to be on the finance committee. And that's where you really look to bring a larger group of people together to be able to do the work of the finance committee. And the finance committee is doing two things. It's putting together the budget that support the ministries of the church. And so the rest of your finance committee should be made up of individuals throughout the church who not only know something about numbers and finances, but they also need to know things about the ministry of the church, the needs in the community and the needs of the congregation. So I just allow finance committees to know that don't just look for people on the finance committee who know numbers, because it has to be a holistic view of your church's ministry to be able to really put together a good budget. And I also let people know that you need to have a prayer warrior on your finance committee. A prayer warrior is somebody who brings that special gift of being able to help the finance committee understand and trust that God is in their midst and will be part and parcel of their budget process as they try to make the budget at the first part of the year and as they carry through on watching the finances book throughout the rest of the year. So we talked about their budget. The budget's the primary aspect of what the finance committee is going to create each year. And I would highly recommend that churches think of this as more than just numbers on a page. So we often talk with churches about narrative budgets. And a narrative budget is simply putting words to the numbers that are on the page, that this is the ministry that we're doing for this amount of dollars. And it can be done either in words or in pictures to show the ministries of the church and how the church is planning to spend the money towards those ministries. So it's more of a vision. It's a vision for the church to be able to understand what the church's main goals are going to be in that next year. It's also an opportunity to challenge the church and put challenges before the congregation in this narrative budget. So there are three different types of budgets that we would consider. The first is an operating budget. This is normally just your standard donations and expenses of the church. The second one is a capital budget. If you're doing any kind of capital campaigns or building expansions, this is typical to have that as a separate budget. And then a legacy budget can also be considered for those churches that have endowments and those types of investments where special projects and special grants are made from church legacy funds. Those three can be three separate budgets, or they can all be one budget, all combined into the same document. When we're looking at budgets, we like to group the budgets into committee groups. And it allows a committee to be able to look at a budget and know that this category in their budget is their responsibility. So I look at typically budgets that have a worship section in their budget. They have a section that's made for worship. They might have a separate budget line for the pastor's compensation. They might have a separate line in the budget for the trustees. By grouping those aspects of their budget into separate groups, then each one of their committees can have ownership for it. And that ownership goes a long way when it comes to controlling the spending of the church. As you're putting your budget together, it's best for transparency purposes to denote those items that are going to be funded by fees, anything that's going to be taken out of reserve funds, or things that will be taken out of endowments, so that transparency of where the income is going to come from to support each one of your budget line items is very transparent to the organization. So once you have your budget in place, there's a couple key things to keep in mind as you're going through the course of the year. First thing is, the budget is a spending plan. It's your projection of what you expect to happen for your income and expenses in a given year. And we all know as well with our personal budgets that the spending plan isn't always reality. So there's oftentimes a need to change what you had forecasted as your ability to spend dollars towards ministries. And so those come up for conversation. And the way to address those are that you bring them to the Finance Committee. And the Finance Committee identifies to the church council, provides them with a recommendation that, let's say, for instance, the snow removal cost this year was $500 more than we had anticipated in our budget. So the Finance Committee is bringing to the church council a proposal that says we're going to increase the expense on snow removal this year by $500, and we're going to take $500 out of, let's call it the pastor's discretionary fund. That we're going to take it out of the pastor's discretionary fund, and we're now going to move that over into the snow removal line item. I coach finance committees to do this formally as they see those types of expenses hit the church that cause them to have to change the way that they're thinking about their ministries in any given year. So by taking it to the church council, it keeps everybody on the same page and allows committees. For instance, you might have to tell the fellowship committee that their budget might have to be reduced by $500. It allows them to be part of that process so that you don't overspend the funds that a church has available in any given year. So the other skill that I like about budgets is that if you're looking at your budget, it's good to graph your income and expenses for a given year. This is one of those things that will give you some insight into your trends, and it will allow you to compare this year's giving trend to last year's giving trend and those of prior years. By knowing whether your giving trend is continuing to grow or it's one that's, for whatever reason, might be declining, it allows you to know whether your budget is in a good position for weathering where your trends are going. So by graphing those, you might be able to get a good look ahead at the data. And it gives you some chance to investigate why your trends might be changing. So as you do this each month, you get to the point with these graphs where you can forecast your year-end income. And if you did that each month, you'd be able to tell your finance committee and your church council whether or not you look to be still on budget or not. So a forecast of your year-end allows you to respond to any types of shortfalls earlier than later. so that if you can respond to a shortfall that's anticipated because you're projecting a smaller than budgeted income, it allows you to make a decision perhaps in June rather than waiting till November or December, where it might be too late for you to be able to change your budget before you understand what your true income was for that year. I also think that when you're doing the forecasts of year-end numbers, this is a skill that not everybody likes to do this, but I have a sense that there's young people in our churches as well as youth who might see this as their first job on a finance committee, to be able to graph data and do forecasts of that data for the finance committee. So I would open the opportunity to allow you to find innovative ways in which you can bring young people and people who normally wouldn't see themselves on finance committees into that overall process. The last skill that I would say about when you're building a budget is to develop a budget that has a sense of what if. So the way that this happens is you anticipate what would happen if my income was to be 2% less than what is in this budget. What line items of expense would I reduce because of that? Or what would happen if I had a 5% drop off in my income? What types of things would I take off the budget from that standpoint? So we would introduce a slide that talks about the rings of defense. And what I would say first is that there are expenses in a budget that can be viewed as rings of defense. And they simply say that there are some items in the budget that are easier to do without and could be reduced quickly. If given notice, you could cut these expenses in a period of 1 or 2 months. And there are other expenses that are really essentially fixed costs to the church. This is the difference between an outer ring, those types of expenses that can be cut quickly, and an inner ring, those types of expenses that really are fixed costs to the church. When you think about building a budget and anticipating the what ifs, what happens if my income is 2% less, I start to look at what types of items are in that outer ring. What are the items that are outer ring that I could cut to manage a 2% reduction in my income? Some of those items could include churches that are making a 13th or an additional payment on any of their debt. It could be the opportunity to reduce building expenses, things that could be delayed until funds were available. It could be looking at funds that are set aside for the replacement of major systems in your church. It could be reducing travel and supplies that are used by the church. It could also be using volunteers in a way in which you're replacing things that were normally spent by expense, for instance, lawn care, and then you were able to replace those with volunteers to do that type of work. It could also be a cleaning service that you have today for an expense that could be done by volunteers. So as you think about those what ifs, these are the types of items that you would look to say, these are the types of categories that you could reduce if you had to do with a 2% or 5% less in your budget. Now the fact is, most churches don't have that outer ring. A lot of churches look at this and they don't have an outer ring already available. And if they start to do any types of reductions, they're thinking they're more in the middle ring or the inner ring on this slide. Things that would start to impact their ability to pay their pastor full time. Things that would impact their ability to pay apportionments or to pay clergy benefits. So the key when making a budget is to make sure that you're creating a budget that has an outer ring to it. So it's very important to try to build the capacity of the church so that you do have an outer ring. Lots of churches may not have a 13th payment for their mortgage. It would be important for them to think about creating that so that you had an outer ring. This replacement funding that's on this slide that talks about putting aside monies associated with building replacements for major systems. A lot of churches don't have that already. So, but if you were to create that, you would be creating an outer ring so that you could handle any downturn on those types of income problems. So that's the management that I would see and recommend to folks as they think about their budgets. It's just having that what-if scenario as you're putting the budget together. When we come to conclusion here on the basics for our finance committees, it really does center around compiling the budget, putting a budget before the church that allows it to be a transparent transaction on how the monies of the church are being used towards ministry. Once again, that budget is compiled by the finance committee. It is sent to the church council for approval. And then once that's in place, it's up to the finance committee to be able to talk about how they're going to raise the funds to support that budget and make any adjustments in the budget according to how much expense they have and how much income they've gathered. It is also the responsibility of the finance committee to administer the church funds and to also supervise the treasurer and the finance secretary as they're doing their duties. I hope this has been a short introduction to what you might take on as a participation on a finance committee at your local church. If you are interested in any other materials that might help you in understanding what finance committees are all about, I would direct you to our website at the conference. It's www.bwcumc.org, and in that finance section you'll find more material on this subject. We thank you for your participation.